His pregnant wife screamed behind the flames. What the Mafia boss did changed everything. Fire doesn't announce itself with thunder, it whispers first. Naomi heard it in the soft crackle of nursery curtains catching flame, the hungry breath of old pine boards inhaling heat before smoke clawed into her lungs. She stood framed in the bedroom window, one hand pressed against her pregnant belly, the other against glass that was already growing warm. Outside on the front lawn, Jun-seo stood completely still. Around him, shadows gathered, men with car engines running, hands near weapons, waiting for the command they'd followed for years. Naomi's voice broke through the night, raw and desperate. Jun-seo. He didn't move toward his men. He didn't reach for a phone. In Seoul's underground, they used to call him Jun-seo, the Black Ledger, the man who erased people with a whisper. Now he stood frozen, watching his pregnant wife burn. Someone told me stories like this don't grow channels. I think they're wrong. If this resonates with you, subscribe and let me know in the comments. It genuinely helps more than you realize. Now let's begin. Everyone expected him to give the order. He didn't. Not because he couldn't. Jun-seo had ended careers before, quietly, surgically, the way you close a book that no one needs to read again. Violence had never been impulse for him. It was accounting. Balance the ledger, eliminate the variable, move forward. But he had walked away from that world the night Naomi looked at him in a hospital corridor and refused to let him disappear. She had been his redemption, the woman who believed a man who trafficked in information could learn to trade in honesty instead. Then the fire came, and it came with a signature he recognized immediately, not from rivals but from the syndicate he'd tried to leave behind. They had written to him once, "A man cannot walk away from the book he wrote." He had ignored them. Now the book burned around his wife, and his former men waited in the darkness for him to respond the only way they understood, with violence that would echo through Seoul's underground like a warning. Naomi screamed again. The sound cut through calculation, through every carefully constructed wall between Jun-seo and Jun-seo. This fire wasn't meant to kill quickly. 2 ignition points, escape routes blocked. This was strategy, not rage. They wanted time. Time for him to make a choice in front of witnesses, in front of his own men. Become the monster again, or watch everything burn. Jun-seo moved. Not toward the shadows where his enforcers waited. Not toward the phone that could unleash the violence he'd spent years trying to bury. He moved toward the flames. His shoulder hit the back door as it splintered with heat, smoke swallowing him whole. He found Naomi in the hallway, wrapped her in his coat, pressed her face against his chest, and counted steps to the exit. Not with the precision of murder, but with the precision of love. 1, 2, 3. They broke through the front entrance as the roof groaned above them. Naomi collapsed onto the damp grass, coughing, trembling, alive. The baby's heartbeat held steady beneath her ribs like a drum refusing to be silenced. Neighbors were filming. Sirens approached in the distance. Jun-seo's men closed in, eyes sharp, ready for the retaliation command they knew was coming. The old rules were absolute. Someone tries to burn your family, you burn their entire world until no ember survives. Jun-seo turned to face them, ash in his hair, his wife's blood on his hands from where he'd carried her through broken glass. He said words no one in Seoul's underground had ever heard spoken with such finality. No one touches them. We end this another way. They stared at him like the fire had burned his mind. Violence was the language they all spoke. Mercy was a myth that got men killed. They waited for the real order, the one that made sense. It never came, because the fire wasn't what terrified Jun-seo. It was the decision forming in his chest, the one that would take longer than flames, cut deeper than smoke, and teach the men who burned his house that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is refuse to become what his enemies need him to be. The days that followed split Jun-seo's life cleanly in two. Naomi was hospitalized for smoke inhalation and stress, but the baby's heartbeat held steady, stubborn, insistent, alive. When she finally woke through the oxygen fog, her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me the truth, all of it." So he did. And to understand what Jun-seo told her that night, you need to know who Jun-seo had been before Naomi, before redemption, before he believed a man could be anything other than the sum of his sins. People used to whisper his name in Seoul's underground corridors, rarely above a murmur. Jun-seo, the Black Ledger. He didn't run casinos or manage enforcers. He didn't need to. He controlled something more valuable than muscle. Information. Who owed, who stole, who lied. In a world where violence left bodies and bodies left evidence, Jun-seo learned early that the cleanest way to destroy someone wasn't through bullets. It was through erasure. A businessman who crossed the syndicate would wake to find his accounts frozen, his contracts voided, his reputation reduced to rumor and ash. A trader's family would discover debts they never owed appearing in ledgers they couldn't dispute. Jun-seo didn't kill people. He made them disappear from the systems that proved they existed. No blood, no witnesses, just gaps where threats used to be. He had learned this power young, watching his mentor manipulate city records with a phone call and a bribe. Information wasn't just currency, it was architecture. Build the right structure, and you could collapse a man's entire life without ever meeting him. Jun-seo perfected the craft. His ledgers were legend. Coded, memorized, impossible to steal because they lived inside his mind. He could recite transactions from 5 years prior, remember which official owed favors, know exactly which pressure point would make someone cooperate. Fear followed him like a second shadow, but it was the quiet kind. The kind that made men lower their voices when he entered a room, not because he demanded it, but because silence felt safer than being noticed. Then came the night that changed everything. Jun-seo had gone to visit an elderly neighbor in the hospital. A man who had no family, no syndicate ties, just loneliness and a failing heart. It was an odd mercy Jun-seo allowed himself. A small crack in the ledger of his life. That's where he met her. Aisha Naomi Adebayo, the woman who laughed too loudly in hospital corridors and refused to let suffering make her smaller. She volunteered there, bringing warmth to places that had forgotten it existed. She saw him trying to leave before anyone could ask questions. She didn't let him. "You came all this way," she said, smiling. "At least tell me your name." He should have lied. Instead, he told her the truth. Jun-seo. Naomi was the first person who looked at him and didn't see a function. Not a fixer, not a ledger, not a weapon. She saw a man who visited dying strangers and didn't know how to accept gratitude. She asked him to coffee. He said no 3 times before saying yes. She talked about Lagos, about faith, about believing people carried more than their worst choices. He listened like someone learning a language he'd forgotten existed. Jun-seo became Jun-seo because of her. Slowly, deliberately, like dismantling a bomb. He filed for legitimate business licenses. He donated money laundered clean into scholarships. He shaved the shadows from his life and learned to cook badly until Naomi teased him into competence. When they married, it was quiet. No syndicate, no audience. Just 2 people choosing a future that didn't taste like ash. Jun-seo believed redemption was paperwork and time. Marriage certificates. Tax forms. Distance from the underground. He thought if he built enough legitimate structure around himself, the past would stay buried. He was wrong. The letter arrived 6 months into their marriage, slipped under their door like a curse. A man cannot walk away from the book he wrote. No signature. No threat. Just a reminder that the syndicate didn't forget. Jun-seo burned it in the kitchen sink, watching ink turn to smoke. Symbolic. Foolish. When Naomi became pregnant, he sat awake at night with his hand on her belly, whispering apologies to a child who hadn't yet been born. For every ledger, every erasure, every person he'd reduced to nothing. He thought love could outweigh history. But Jun-seo's past didn't argue. It didn't negotiate. It simply watched, patient as debt, waiting for the moment Jun-seo would learn that some books don't burn. They just wait for the right reader to open them again. The fire did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a decision. 1 minute Naomi was brewing ginger tea in the kitchen, humming something soft from her childhood. The next, the back of the house bloomed with heat. Not everywhere at once, that would have been merciful. The nursery curtains caught first, yellow fabric curling black like dying petals. Then the hallway runner ignited, flames spreading in a deliberate line toward the bedrooms. 2 ignition points, placed precisely where escape routes converged. This wasn't rage. It was geometry. Naomi smelled it before she saw it. Gasoline mixing with burning pine, acrid and intentional. She ran toward the nursery, instinct overriding reason, and stopped cold at the doorway. The crib they'd assembled together was already wreathed in smoke, the mobile above it melting into twisted shapes. Heat pushed her back, stinging her eyes, clawing at her lungs. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the baby kick in protest, and screamed Jun-seo's name like it could rewrite what was already happening. Outside, Jun-seo stood motionless on the front lawn, and for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, his mind split cleanly in two. Instinct said war. His men were already arriving, headlights cutting through the smoke-thickened air. Car doors opened. Silhouettes emerged. Ready. He knew their names, their skills, their loyalty. One phone call and the people who did this would be erased. Not from records this time, but from existence. Violence had always been mathematics for him. Identify the problem, remove it, restore balance. The equation was simple. The solution was waiting. But then Naomi screamed again, and something older than instinct moved through him. Not the ledger. Not Jun-seo's cold precision. Something raw and uncontrolled that recognized only one truth. She was inside, and he was not. Choice said, save. Jun-seo sprinted toward the flames. Not toward his men, not toward strategy, toward her. The back door resisted, swollen with heat, and he threw his shoulder against it until it splintered and gave way. Smoke swallowed him whole, thick and black, burning his throat with every breath. He couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except the roar of fire consuming the home they'd built. But he knew this house. Every corner, every distance, every step memorized from months of walking these floors at night when pregnancy kept Naomi awake. He found her in the hallway, coughing violently, one hand braced against the wall, the other cradling her stomach. Her eyes met his through the haze, wide with terror and relief and something else. Trust that nearly broke him. He wrapped her in his coat, pressed her face against his chest to shield her from the smoke, and counted each step toward the exit by memory. 1, 2, 3. Not the precision of murder, the precision of love. They broke through the front entrance as the roof groaned above them, threatening collapse. Naomi's legs gave out on the damp grass, and she fell to her knees, coughing so hard her whole body shook. Neighbors had gathered across the street, phones raised, filming everything. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer but not close enough. Jun-seo's men surrounded them immediately, forming a protective circle, eyes scanning for threats. One of them, Tae-sung, who'd been with him since the beginning, grabbed his arm. "Boss, we know who did this. Give us the word. We'll handle it tonight." Another voice, urgent. "They'll try again if we don't send a message." This was a declaration, Jun-seo. You can't let this stand. They were right. The old rules were absolute, written in blood and upheld through generations. Someone burns your family, you burn their entire world. Hesitation was weakness. Mercy was suicide. Jun-seo had enforced these rules himself once, balanced ledgers that demanded payment in pain. But he looked down at Naomi, still gasping for air, her hand never leaving her belly where their daughter grew, stubborn and alive. The sirens were seconds away now, red and blue lights already painting the street in stuttering color. The neighbors were watching. The world was watching. Jun-seo straightened, ash in his hair, his wife's blood on his hands from where broken glass had cut her. He turned to his men, these men who would bleed for him without question, and spoke words that made them flinch. "No one touches them. We end this another way." Silence. Disbelief. Tae-sung stared at him like the smoke had damaged his brain. "Boss, you can't be." "I said no." They waited for the real order, the one that made sense. It never came. Naomi's hand found his, trembling and cold. She looked up at him, oxygen mask hanging loose around her neck, and whispered through damaged lungs, "Don't let this be our child's story." Jun-seo knelt beside her as the ambulance pulled up, and made a promise that would cost him everything he'd once been. It won't be. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Naomi lay propped against thin pillows, an oxygen mask resting below her chin like a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Her hands trembled when she reached for the water cup, not from weakness but from the adrenaline that hadn't yet left her body. Monitors beeped steadily beside the bed. Her heartbeat, the baby's heartbeat, two rhythms refusing to be silenced. Jun-seo sat in the chair beside her, still wearing clothes that smelled of smoke. His forearms bandaged where glass had sliced through skin. He hadn't left her side since the ambulance doors closed. Hadn't slept. Hadn't answered the 17 missed calls from his men. He just watched the monitor, counting each heartbeat like currency he couldn't afford to lose. Naomi's voice cut through the mechanical beeping, hoarse but steady. All of it, Jun-seo. I need to hear all of it. He had burned a letter once, thinking fire could erase truth. Now he understood that some things only grow stronger when you try to destroy them. So he told her. He told her about becoming Jun-seo. Not born into it, but built into it, piece by piece, until the name fit like scar tissue. How he learned that information was a blade sharper than any knife, cleaner than any bullet. How he'd erased people from existence without ever touching them. Frozen accounts, voided contracts, debts that appeared in ledgers like curses. How fear had followed him quietly, the kind that made rooms go silent not because he demanded it, but because silence felt safer than being noticed. He told her about the ledger he'd kept in his mind. Names, dates, transactions coded in a language only he understood. How power had felt inevitable, natural, like breathing. How he'd walked away from it all not because he was caught, but because he looked at himself one morning and realized he'd become something that couldn't be loved, only used. He told her about the syndicate faction that saw his departure as treason. How they'd sent the warning he'd burned. How the fire tonight wasn't random. It was a signature, a message written in smoke and gasoline. You don't get to be new. Naomi listened without interrupting, her hand resting on her belly where their daughter kicked occasionally, as if reminding them both why this conversation mattered. When Jun-seo finally stopped talking, his voice scraped raw. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't recoil. She took his hand. I married you knowing you had a past, she said quietly. I just didn't know its name. Her fingers tightened around his. You don't get to control whether they forgive you, Jun-seo. You don't get to control whether I forgive you. She paused, her eyes finding his with the kind of clarity that only comes from carrying two lives, hers and their child's. But you get to control who our daughter meets when she's old enough to ask questions. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through everything he thought he understood about redemption. Jun-seo had spent years believing that walking away was enough, that marriage certificates and legitimate business licenses could build walls high enough to keep the past out. He'd thought redemption was a destination you reached through distance and time. But Naomi was showing him something different. Redemption wasn't about erasing who you'd been. It was about deciding who your child would know you to be. If you go to war with them, Naomi continued, her voice stronger now, if you answer fire with fire, she'll grow up in the shadow of it. She'll hear the stories. She'll see the fear in people's eyes when they hear your name. She placed his hand on her belly, where their daughter moved beneath skin and hope. But if you end this another way, if you refuse to become what they need you to be, maybe she gets a different story. Maybe she gets a father, not a legend. Jun-seo felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been sealed shut since the night he'd first learned to trade mercy for power. He realized then that retaliation wouldn't save anything. Even if every enemy vanished, even if the syndicate burned to ashes, the story written about him would remain. A man who answered fear with fear. A legacy traded like a curse through bloodlines. His daughter deserved better than inheritance built on violence. Outside the hospital window, Seoul's lights blinked in the darkness. Thousands of lives unfolding in rooms like this one. People making choices that would echo forward into futures they couldn't yet see. Jun-seo squeezed Naomi's hand and made a decision that terrified him more than any ledger ever had. He would end this, but not with the tools Jun-seo had mastered. He would end it by refusing to be Jun-seo at all. Jun-seo walked into the government building on a Tuesday morning with the kind of calm that made security officers reach for their radios. No appointment. No lawyer. No weapon except memory, and memory had always been his sharpest blade. He approached the front desk where a young clerk was shuffling papers, trying to look busy. "I need to speak with someone from the Financial Crimes Division," Jun-seo said quietly. "Tell them Minaseo the Black Ledger is here to make a statement." The clerk's pen stopped moving. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Jun-seo said it, like confessing to a murder that hadn't been discovered yet, made her hand tremble as she reached for the phone. Within 10 minutes, he was in an interrogation room with 3 investigators who couldn't decide if they were being handed a gift or walking into a trap. Jun-seo sat across from them, hands folded on the metal table, and began to speak. He gave them names first. Not street names or aliases, but real names, the ones written on business licenses and bank accounts, the ones that appeared in city council meetings and charity galas. He gave them dates. When money moved, where it washed clean, which officials took envelopes and which ones simply looked away. He gave them maps of corruption drawn from memory, every corridor and connection he'd spent years building. The lead investigator, a woman named Park with gray temples and skeptical eyes, leaned forward. "Why now? What do you want in exchange?" "Protection," Jun-seo said. "Not for me. For my wife and our child." "That's it." Park's pen hovered over her notepad. "No immunity deal? No witness relocation for yourself?"
No.
Inside Jun-seo's mind, Minaseo screamed. This was insanity.
Suicide.
You don't hand the system a knife and ask it to be gentle. The old instincts clawed at him, demanding he stop talking, walk out, disappear the way he'd made others disappear. War was predictable. War had rules. Violence could be controlled, measured, balanced in ledgers that always closed. But Jun-seo kept talking because Naomi's words had rewritten the equation. You get to control who our daughter meets. If he went to war, his daughter would inherit enemies like heirlooms. She'd grow up looking over her shoulder, learning that love meant living in the crossfire. She'd know her father as Minaseo, the Black Ledger, the man who solved problems by erasing them. But if he chose sunlight instead of shadows, if he turned information into testimony rather than weapons, maybe she could grow up believing her father was someone who chose truth when it was hardest. It took 6 hours to give his statement. Park's team brought in recorders, laptops, specialists who cross-referenced every name he provided against databases that glowed with evidence they'd been chasing for years. Jun-seo's memory was flawless. He'd built his power on remembering what others forgot. Now he weaponized that memory against the very system he'd once served. This will destroy dozens of operations, Park said finally, exhaustion and something like awe in her voice. You understand what you've just done? Yes. Jun-seo stood, his reflection pale in the one-way mirror. I've made myself a traitor to everyone. By evening, the shockwaves began. Accounts froze across Seoul. Warrants were issued. Syndicate operatives woke to find their safe houses raided. Their networks dismantled not with explosions but with audits. The underground didn't know how to respond to attacks that came through courtrooms instead of back alleys. Jun-seo's phone vibrated with messages he didn't open. His men wanted answers. The syndicate wanted blood. The faction that had burned his house wanted to know what kind of man trades his entire world for the safety of 2 people who hadn't even met yet. The media couldn't categorize him. Traitor to criminals, criminal to the law-abiding. A man who refused both thrones and somehow threatened everyone by refusing to play the game. But when Jun-seo returned to the hospital that night, slipping past reporters who'd learned his name, he found Naomi awake, monitors still beeping steadily. She looked at him, understanding everything without asking. Is it done? She whispered. It started, he corrected, sitting beside her bed, taking her hand. They'll come for me, for us, but not the way they expect. Naomi's thumb traced circles on his palm, the same gesture she'd used when they first met, when she'd refused to let him disappear before telling her his name. Our daughter will ask about this someday. Jun-seo looked at the monitor where their child's heartbeat pulsed, steady and stubborn. I know. And when she does, I want to tell her I chose her future over my past. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent rhythm. But in the underground corridors where whispers had once carried Min-seo's name like a curse, a different kind of fear was spreading. The fear that maybe redemption wasn't mythology after all. Maybe it was just a man deciding that some cycles had to end, even if ending them felt like setting yourself on fire. The syndicate had survived wars before. Territorial disputes, internal coups, police crackdowns. Violence had always been whether they could navigate. But what Jun-seo unleashed wasn't a storm. It was erosion. The first accounts froze on Wednesday. Not the obvious ones, those had been scrubbed clean years ago. But the hidden ones, the nested shell companies where money rested between transactions. By Thursday, 3 high-ranking members had been called in for questioning. By Friday, auditors were walking through businesses that had operated untouched for decades, spreadsheets in hand instead of search warrants. No gunfights, no explosions, just paper trails becoming prison sentences. In the underground corridors where power had always been measured in fear and firepower, a different kind of panic spread. Paranoia replaced confidence. If Min-seo had remembered these accounts, what else did he remember? Whose name would appear next in those flawless ledgers he'd carried in his mind? Leaders who'd felt invincible suddenly walked through doorways wondering if the walls were listening. The syndicate fractured from within. Some wanted Jun-seo dead, immediately, publicly, as a message. Others argued that killing him now would only validate everything he'd told the authorities. Factions that had cooperated for years began turning on each other, each suspecting the other of being the next leak. The empire Min-seo had helped build with information was now collapsing under the weight of that same information. But something else happened that no one expected. People began talking. Not the criminals, the others. The shopkeeper in Gangnam who'd been drowning in debt until someone anonymously paid it off. The widow whose medical bills had disappeared without explanation. The college student whose scholarship had appeared from a foundation she'd never heard of. They didn't know it was Min-seo who'd helped them. They'd never seen his face, never known his name. But as investigators dug deeper, patterns emerged. Money quietly redirected, debts erased without ceremony, help given to those who had no leverage and nothing to offer in return. A different story began spreading, not the legend of the Black Ledger who erased people, but of a man who'd used his power in ways he never wanted credit for. It didn't erase what he'd done, didn't absolve the ledgers he'd balanced with fear, but it complicated the narrative in ways that made media headlines stumble over themselves trying to categorize him. In the hospital room, Naomi watched it all unfold through news reports and whispered updates from Jun-seo. She saw the strain in his shoulders, the way he checked his phone less and held her hand more. The doctors had cleared her to go home, but they stayed an extra day, letting the initial chaos settle. "You're different," she said one evening, her hand resting on her belly where their daughter had started kicking harder, as if impatient to meet the world they were rebuilding for her. Jun-seo looked up from where he'd been staring at nothing, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. "Different how?" "Min-seo controlled things," Naomi said carefully. "Calculated outcomes, balanced ledgers. You can't control this, any of it. But you're not trying to anymore." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I spent years believing power meant knowing what would happen next. That if I could see all the variables, I could determine the result." He placed his hand over hers on her stomach. "But I can't determine who she'll become. Can't calculate what kind of father I'll be. Can't predict whether any of this will be enough." "No," Naomi agreed. "You can't. It's terrifying. It's called being human, Jun-seo." She squeezed his hand. Min-seo was a weapon, efficient, precise, controlled. "You're choosing to be something harder. A father. A husband. A man who doesn't know the ending but keeps walking toward it anyway." Outside their window, Seoul glowed with evening lights. Somewhere in those streets, the syndicate was tearing itself apart. Somewhere, investigators were building cases that would take years to prosecute. Somewhere, his former men were deciding whether loyalty meant following him into this uncertain territory or cutting ties before they drowned in the fallout. Jun-seo had no control over any of it. And for the first time in his life, that felt like progress rather than failure. The nurse knocked softly, entering with discharge papers. "You're cleared to go home tomorrow morning," she said with a gentle smile. "Baby's strong. Mom's recovering well. Home." The word felt strange. The house had burned. Everything they'd built together had turned to ash and smoke. But as Naomi smiled at him, tired, hopeful, alive, Jun-seo realized home had never been the building. It was this. The three of them, heartbeats synchronized on monitors, refusing to let fear write the final chapter. "Thank you," Naomi told the nurse. After she left, Jun-seo leaned back in the uncomfortable hospital chair that had become his vigil post. "They'll try again," he said quietly. "The ones who burned the house. They won't stop just because I testified." "I know," Naomi said, "but they expected you to answer with violence. You answered with truth instead. That's the crack in their foundation, Jun-seo. Not the accounts you froze. Not the people you named. The fact that you refused to become what they needed you to be." He looked at her, this woman who'd seen him at his most terrified and still chose to believe he could be more than his worst instincts. "Our daughter is lucky," he said softly. Naomi laughed, the sound rough from smoke damage but genuine. "She doesn't exist yet and she's already changed the world. Imagine what she'll do when she's actually here." Jun-seo closed his eyes, let himself imagine it. A future where his daughter never had to whisper his name like a curse. Where she could say, "My father," without fear following the words. Felt impossible. But then again, so had everything else he'd done in the past week. The threats came quietly, the way winter rain arrives. Persistent, cold, inevitable. The first letter appeared 3 days after they moved into a temporary apartment. Slipped under the door while they slept. No return address. No signature. Just 8 words in careful handwriting. "Testimony can't protect what fire already touched." Jun-seo burned it before Naomi woke, but she found the ashes in the sink anyway. "How many?" she asked, one hand braced against the counter, the other resting on her belly where their daughter had begun pressing against her ribs, running out of room. "3 this week," he admitted. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just nodded and went back to folding the baby clothes they'd had to buy new. Everything from the nursery lost to smoke and flame. Jun-seo watched her hands move. Steady, deliberate, refusing to tremble, and felt something like awe. The surveillance was less subtle. A car that followed them to prenatal appointments, always 3 vehicles back, never quite close enough to justify calling the police. A man in a coffee shop who watched too long, his newspaper unread. Footsteps in the stairwell that stopped when Jun-seo opened the door, finding empty hallways that somehow felt occupied. He knew the language of intimidation. He'd written it himself once, calculated exactly how much pressure to apply before someone broke. Now he was on the receiving end, and the familiarity made it worse, not better. He knew what came after the watching, after the letters, after the waiting. The nightmares started in the second week. Always the same. Naomi behind glass, fire climbing walls, and his feet locked to the ground while his voice disappeared into smoke. He'd wake gasping, sheets twisted, Naomi's hand already reaching for him in the dark. "I'm here," she'd whisper. "We're here. Breathe." But some nights breathing felt like drowning. One morning, Jun-seo found himself standing at the apartment window at 4 a.m., watching the street below for cars that didn't belong. His reflection ghosted against the glass. Behind him, Naomi shifted on the couch where she'd been sleeping lately. The bed hurt her back now that the baby had dropped lower. "You haven't slept," she said, not a question. "I can't." His voice came out hollow. "Every time I close my eyes, I see you burning. Every sound in the hallway might be them. Every car that slows down." "Jun-seo." Naomi pushed herself upright with effort. 8 months pregnant and still somehow the strongest person in the room. "Come here." He crossed to her, and she took his hands, placing them on her belly where their daughter was awake, kicking against his palms like she was trying to remind him why any of this mattered. "You are not Min-seo anymore," Naomi said firmly, "unless you choose to be." That's what they want, to scare you back into being the man who solved problems by erasing them. They want you paranoid, violent, predictable. She pressed his hands more firmly against the life moving beneath her skin. But she needs you to be Jun-seo, the man who walks into fire to save people, not the one who burns everything down. What if I can't protect you both? The question broke something open in his chest. What if choosing sunlight instead of shadows gets you killed? Then we die human, Naomi said simply. Not as weapons. Not as casualties of a war that never ends. As people who chose love even when fear made more sense. She smiled, exhausted but certain. I'd rather die as your wife than survive as Jun-seo's hostage. The words should have terrified him. Instead, they steadied something that had been shaking since the fire. Days blurred into routine built on stubborn hope. Naomi laughed at the prenatal class where they were the only couple who'd arrived with a security detail waiting outside. She craved fried plantains at midnight and sent Jun-seo scrambling through convenience stores, turning the hunt into adventure. They argued about names. She wanted something that meant light or new beginning. He suggested anything that couldn't be weaponized into a headline. What about Amara? Naomi offered one evening, sitting on the floor because the couch no longer accommodated her comfortably. It means grace in Igbo. Jun-seo tested the name silently, imagining saying it in playgrounds, at graduations, at moments that felt impossibly far away. Amara, he repeated. It's beautiful. And nothing like Black Ledger, Naomi added with a tired smile. She gets her own story. That night, another letter arrived. Jun-seo read it standing in the doorway, rain starting to fall outside, the words sharper than before. Grace won't save what testimony already condemned. He looked back at Naomi, asleep on the couch with one hand resting on her belly, their daughter's heartbeat steady beneath her palm. For the first time since the threats began, Jun-seo felt something other than fear. He felt resolve. Jun-seo would have already retaliated, traced the letters, identified the sender, ended the threat permanently. But Jun-seo folded the letter carefully and placed it in the folder he was keeping for investigators. Evidence. Documentation. The tools of a man who'd chosen law over ledgers. Felt impossible. Fragile. Insane. But then again, so did believing that one person could walk away from an empire and still deserve to hold his daughter when she was born. Jun-seo closed the door, locked it, and returned to the couch. He sat beside Naomi, his hand joining hers on her belly, and whispered into the quiet. Your mother is the bravest person I've ever known, Amara, and I'm trying to be worthy of you both. Outside, the rain continued, persistent, cold, inevitable. Inside, 3 heartbeats refused to be silenced. The contractions started at dawn, when the sky was still bruised purple and the world hadn't yet decided whether to commit to daylight. Naomi woke Jun-seo with a grip on his wrist that would have broken bone if she tried harder. It's time, she said, breathless but steady. Always steady. The drive to the hospital blurred past in fragments. Traffic lights that seemed designed to delay them. Naomi's breathing measured in counts of 4. Jun-seo's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He checked the rearview mirror 3 times for cars that might be following before forcing himself to stop. Not today. Today belonged to something bigger than fear. Outside the hospital windows, autumn leaves fell like endings that didn't need flames. Gold and rust tumbling through air that smelled of rain and change. The labor lasted 9 hours. Jun-seo had faced violence without flinching, had stared down men who killed for less than eye contact, had balanced ledgers that held lives in columns of ink and numbers. None of it had prepared him for this, for watching Naomi fight through pain he couldn't ledger away or erase with a phone call. He held her hand, gave her ice chips, whispered encouragements that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what her body was doing. You're doing beautifully, the midwife said during the 8th hour, calm as if miracles happened here every day. Perhaps they did. Naomi's laugh came out strangled, sweat-soaked, furious with exhaustion. Liar, she gasped. But she was smiling through tears, squeezing Jun-seo's hand like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. At 3:47 p.m., when the leaves outside had piled golden against the curb, Their daughter arrived screaming into the world. Furious, alive, impossibly tiny. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, clearing airways, checking vitals, wrapping fragile limbs in soft cotton. But Jun-seo couldn't hear their medical assessments. He could only hear his daughter's voice, announcing her existence to a world that had tried to burn her before she was born. "She's perfect," Naomi whispered, reaching for the small bundle the nurse was bringing toward them.
Jun-seo, ligger her.
They placed Amara in his arms, and Jun-seo forgot how to breathe. She was so small, 6 pounds, 4 ounces of human, eyes squeezed shut, one tiny fist pressed against her mouth as if already contemplating whether the world outside had been worth the journey. Her skin was darker than his, lighter than Naomi's, something entirely her own, already refusing to be defined by what came before. Jun-seo's hands shook, actually trembled, something they hadn't done when he'd erased men from existence, when he'd walked into burning buildings, when he'd testified against an empire. Violence had always felt easy. Clean equations, clear solutions, problems removed and gaps sealed. But this terrified him in ways ledgers never could. Because violence was simple. You identified threats and eliminated them. You didn't have to care about the aftermath because you'd never see it. But fatherhood was witnessing. It was being seen. It was holding something infinitely fragile and knowing that every choice you made from this moment forward would echo into a life you couldn't control or calculate. "What if I fail her?" The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way Jun-seo would have never allowed. Naomi reached up, her hand finding his face, pulling his gaze from Amara to her. "Then you fail human," she said, exhausted, radiant, absolutely certain. "You fail trying, not by walking away. That's the only promise she needs." Jun-seo looked down at Amara again, at the daughter who would never know Jun-seo, who would only know a father who'd chosen to walk into fire rather than spread it. She yawned, a sound so small it barely registered, and something fundamental shifted in his chest. The syndicate would keep coming. The threats wouldn't stop just because a baby was born. The world outside this hospital room was still dangerous, still unforgiving, still full of people who believed redemption was a story weak men told themselves. But in this moment, with autumn leaves falling like grace outside the window and his daughter's heartbeat steady against his chest, Jun-seo made a vow without speaking it aloud. "The cycle ends with me, not with violence answered by violence, blood paid for in blood, fear inherited like a family name. It ended here with this choice to believe that love could be stronger than legacy, that mercy could be braver than murder, that walking away from power was its own kind of strength." Amara's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark, unfocused, seeing nothing yet somehow seeing everything. Jun-seo touched her impossibly small hand, and her fingers wrapped around his thumb with a grip that felt like forgiveness he hadn't earned but would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. "Hello, Amara," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name. "I'm your father, and I promise you—" He paused, looking at Naomi, who nodded through tears, understanding what he couldn't quite articulate. "I promise you won't inherit my shadows. You get to walk in sunlight." Naomi laughed, the sound mixing with crying, with exhaustion, with joy that somehow survived everything that had tried to destroy it. "She already is," she said, pulling them both closer. Husband, daughter, family built on choices that defied every rule Jun-seo had once lived by. Outside, leaves continued falling, covering the ground in gold. Inside, 3 heartbeats synchronized, stubborn and alive, refusing to let fear write the ending. And in that moment, Jun-seo understood what Naomi had been trying to teach him all along. Redemption wasn't something you achieved once and celebrated. It was something you chose every day, in every small moment, in every decision to be better than what the world expected. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was the only thing worth fighting for. The nightmares never fully left. Even 3 years later, Jun-seo still woke sometimes tasting ash, hearing Naomi scream through fire that existed only in memory. He'd sit up gasping, sheets twisted, his heart racing through calculations his body remembered even when his mind knew better. Exit routes, ignition points, the mathematics of saving what mattered most. But now, Naomi's hand found his in the darkness with practiced ease. "Breathe," she'd whisper, the same anchor she'd been since the night they met in a hospital corridor. "You're here. We're here." And he'd listen, to her breathing, to the silence of their small home, to the sound of Amara sleeping in the next room, her nightlight casting soft shadows that had nothing to do with fire. Some mornings, he'd wake before dawn and walk to Amara's room just to watch her sleep. She'd inherited Naomi's laugh and stubborn optimism, his careful way of thinking through problems before speaking. She had no idea that men once whispered her father's name in underground corridors, that ledgers had been balanced with fear and information, that she'd been born into the aftermath of choices that could have destroyed them all. To her, Jun-seo was simply Appa, the father who made terrible pancakes and better apologies, who read bedtime stories with voices for every character, who flinched at sirens but never explained why. The syndicate faded, not through explosions or retaliation, but through something more permanent, irrelevance. The trials that followed Jun-seo's testimony had fractured the organization beyond repair. Some members went to prison. Others disappeared into legitimate business, trying to become someone new the way Jun-seo had. A few kept trying to rebuild the old empire, but empires need believers, and Jun-seo's choice had planted doubt deeper than any ledger could balance. The threats eventually stopped, not because Jun-seo had won some final confrontation, but because the people who'd sent them realized something more terrifying than violence. He simply didn't care about their approval anymore. You couldn't intimidate a man who'd already walked through fire and chosen something harder than power on the other side. The last letter had arrived on Amara's second birthday. Jun-seo opened it while Naomi decorated cupcakes in the kitchen, expecting the usual threat. Instead, he found 3 words in familiar handwriting. "You were right."
No signature.
No explanation needed. He burned it anyway. Not in fear, but in closure, and returned to help Naomi with frosting that somehow ended up in Amara's hair, on the walls, everywhere except the cupcakes. Now, standing in Amara's doorway at dawn, watching her sleep with her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm, Jun-seo thought about legacy. Not the kind written in ledgers or whispered in back rooms. The kind that woke up demanding pancakes and asking questions about clouds and butterflies and why the sky changed colors. Min-seo had believed power meant controlling outcomes, predicting every variable, balancing equations until they closed perfectly. But Jun-seo had learned something different through Naomi's stubborn faith and Amara's existence. Real power was choosing who you became when no one was forcing your hand. He hadn't become a hero. Heroes got monuments and gratitude. He'd become something harder and less celebrated. Responsible. Responsible for the life growing in the next room. Responsible for the promises he'd made to a woman who believed people could change. Responsible for ensuring that the violence that had defined Min-seo stopped with Jun-seo. Behind him, Naomi appeared, wrapped in the morning quiet, her hand finding his shoulder. "She's growing so fast," she whispered, following his gaze to their sleeping daughter. "She is," Jun-seo agreed. "And she has no idea." "That's the point," Naomi said softly. "She gets to not know. She gets to be a child who doesn't inherit fear." Jun-seo turned to face his wife, the woman who'd refused to let him disappear before telling her his name, who'd survived fire and testified to his past without flinching, who'd chosen to believe redemption was possible even when the world said otherwise. "Thank you," he said, meaning it for everything. For seeing him when he was still Min-seo, for believing in Jun-seo before he existed, for teaching him that the truest revenge is refusing to become what your enemies need you to be. Naomi smiled, the same smile that had first broken through his carefully constructed walls in that hospital corridor years ago. "You did the hard part. You chose to stop." In the next room, Amara stirred, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon, demanding breakfast and stories, and a day that had nothing to do with ledgers or violence or the shadows her father used to carry. Jun-seo took Naomi's hand, and together they walked toward the kitchen to start another ordinary morning, the kind of morning Min-seo never could have imagined, the kind Jun-seo had nearly died to make possible. Years later, when people asked what happened to Jun-seo the Black Ledger, they'd find only fragments. Court transcripts, newspaper articles calling him traitor and informant, conspiracy theories about where he'd gone. The story ended not with a bang but with silence, with a man who'd simply stepped out of the narrative and refused to return. But in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, there lived a family who knew the real ending. A father who still woke sometimes smelling smoke that existed only in dreams, a mother whose steady hands pulled him back to the present, and a daughter who ran through their small yard chasing wind, carrying a name unshadowed by anything except love. Jun-seo learned what Naomi had been trying to teach him from the beginning. You don't defeat your past by fighting it. You defeat it by building something better in its place, one ordinary morning at a time, until the life you're living makes the life you left behind feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. Sometimes the most dangerous mafia boss isn't the one who answers violence with more violence, who builds empires on fear and information, who makes his name synonymous with power. It's the one who walks into fire, saves what matters, and then decides, with full knowledge of what it will cost, what it will take, how impossible it seems, that the cycle ends with him. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.